Hi everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Can you hear me without the mic? All right, beautiful. Hi everyone, my name is Roy. I'm one of the residents here at Green College. It's my pleasure to introduce another resident member's talk today. Our speaker today is Mitchi Kamigaki-Baron, lovely known as Mitchi. Before I proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here at the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Today's talk is another riveting talk in the series of our resident members talk. For those of you who are aware of what the resident members talk is, every resident member presents riveting research that they're working on, and we've got an amazing lineup in the coming months. So I encourage people, especially those who have turned up for the first time, to turn up again and be a part of this amazing series of talks that we're hosting. Few housekeeping points. If you want the toilets, it's straight across the other building, and ask any one of the residents here, and they'll be happy to guide you. Now, going to today's presentation, for over 1,000 years, Hawaii existed as a monolinguistic nation, which is sustained by its indigenous language. Nice. However, did you know that it took about 100 years of colonial inquest to displace that and have English as the predominant language. So today, Mitchi is going to talk about language and colonialism in Hawaii and how that has impacted not just Hawaii, but other countries. So without further ado, everyone, Mitchi. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Hi. I didn't expect you to memorize my whole abstract like that. That was really impressive. I'm Mitchi. Everyone knows, well, some people, I think, well, not everyone knows me. I'm Mitchi. I'm going to be doing this topic on language as colonialism in Hawaii, British Columbia, and abroad. And I'm going to be talking about some topics that I think I want everyone to kind of reflect on how this might affect your own communities. I'm hoping for some discussion at the end on that. Great, so I'm just going to get started. Right, so kind of to just introduce you to some terms, right? A lot of times when we're talking about linguistics, we say linguistic landscape. And so the linguistic landscape in Hawaii is very diverse. There's lots of people. It's in the middle of the Pacific, and it's like the central hub, kind of in between the continental states and Asia, right? So there's a lot of diversity. But I'm going to be focusing on these three languages and the role that this kind of interplay that they have in this power dynamic that they have. So there's English, which is the language of power, basically, right? So this is sometimes called a prestige language. And by prestige language, I mean it's a language that, you should speak if you want to gain power in this society, right? And so English in the landscape of Hawaii is the prestige language. And then kind of in this power dynamic, we have the indigenous languages. So we have ōlelo Hawaiʻi, which is otherwise known as Hawaiian, and then we have Hawaiʻi Creole. And these languages will be kind of marginalized in the power dynamic. I'm going to kind of explain some things about these languages first, and then I'll explain some history as to what happened. Right, so ōlelo Hawaiʻi is the indigenous language of the islands. It's a Polynesian language, so it's related to languages like Maori, Tahitian, Samoan, and like Roy said, over 1,000 years, the Hawaiian Kingdom, it was a kingdom before the states occupied it, was fully sufficient in ōlelo Hawaiʻi, and it took less than 100 years for English to displace ōlelo Hawaiʻi as the language of power, right? So ōlelo Hawaiʻi was a language that was used within government, and it was a fully sufficient, very complex society. Right, and it was a language of power before this kind of, before occupation happened, right? There's this other language, Hawaiʻi Creole. Locally, it's known as Pidgin, so I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. But this is a contact language, and it's a single language that's basically a mixture of a bunch of languages that were featured on the historic multi-ethnic plantation laborer population, right? So you had a bunch of laborers from many different places in the world, right? We had people who were indigenous, speaking ōlelo Hawaiʻi. We had English, people who were basically the people owning the plantations. And then other recruits to the plantations were Japanese people, Portuguese, Chinese and Filipino people, as well as many others. But the main languages that came to mix in this language were the ones that I've mentioned here. And by Chinese and Philippine languages, I mean that they have many languages. So some of the Chinese languages that are thought to be featured in this language were very ancient, and some of them were Cantonese. And then with Philippine languages, some of them are thought to be Tagalog and Visayan. So it's a very diverse language that has a genetic mixture that's not really quite like any other thing, right? That has come to exist. And a lot of Creoles are like this. But one interesting thing is that these laborers were recruited from many countries for the specific intention to maintain control, right? And this is the case with many situations of plantation work, right? You have a plantation owner who says, okay, what is the best way for me to get a bunch of laborers with the poorest working conditions? And I don't want them to talk to each other, because if they talk to each other, then they can rise up, right? And at first this worked because there was a lot of ethnic tension between these different groups, right? They're coming from all these places. They don't know they don't even speak the same language, right? Even from multiple places in China, multiple places in the Philippines, right? So generations later, after a bunch of people came to this plantation, this new language emerged. And it was great because it played an important role for laborers to organize across ethnic lines. And it actually worked. People were able to manage a strike that was unsuccessful for generations. And they finally were able to strike up against the plantation owners. Right, so this power dynamic that I'm discussing today is something that we call in linguistics, and I guess perhaps more broadly, as diglossia. So diglossia is basically these social rules of with whom, where, and when language is socially acceptable to be spoken. It also comes with attitudes as to which languages are considered valuable, right? And so in the case of Pidgin and in ōlelo Hawaiʻi in Hawaii, we see that Pidgin might be associated with negative attitudes, such as, oh, that person speaks Pidgin, they must be poor, uneducated, rough, inappropriate, rude, especially when this language is spoken in the improper context, right? ōlelo Hawaiʻi is also commonly associated with negative descriptors such as archaic, or it's useless, or other things that you might associate with racism with Native people, right? And so these are kind of these circles you can see are kind of the context of which these languages are basically contextualized, right? So you have English that's kind of set. You can speak English anywhere in Hawaii and it's fine, but someone who is perhaps trilingual or bilingual in some of these languages would speak English in formal spaces such as school and professional work. Pidgin would be stuck in casual settings, home settings, or working class kind of jobs. Otherwise, you might be faced with negative consequences. And ōlelo Hawaiʻi is kind of set in traditional spaces, although this is growing increasingly in home and school locations. So what caused diglossia in Hawaii? The hegemonic program of American assimilation, right? And this is kind of a common theme that you'll see throughout the talk. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief timeline as to kind of how this happened, right? So in 1778, Captain James Cook came with a bunch of people, and this was kind of sailors, and this was just marks the first contact with English speakers, but this did not actually affect many people. So the only people who were basically exposed to English during this time were the people who had direct contact with the sailors or traders or these kinds of professions. So this didn't really impact Hawaii in terms of language. But when the missionaries came, this marked foreigners to stay. And so essentially what happened was foreigners to stay also meant foreigners that brought disease to stay. And 95% of Hawaiians died due to foreign disease. This part is kind of emotional for me. So the missionaries blamed mass death on Hawaiian language and religion, and promoted as a solution to mass death English education and Christianity. So here's one quote from this guy. The hula corroded them with leprosy. And in 1896, there were bans on ōlelo Hawai'i in schools. This man made this quote one year before this was institutionalized. With this knowledge of English, we'll go into the young American and Christian ideas. And as this knowledge goes in, kahunaism, fetishism, and heathenism will generally and largely go out, right? Right. There's a lot with that. So right around the same time was the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, right? So plantation owners that were backed by the U.S. Marines overthrew the kingdom. And at first, when this happened, the U.S. government realized that this was unconstitutional because it was, right? It was people who brought guns, basically, held it to the queen's head, placed her on house arrest, okay? So this was actually ruled as unconstitutional. But in 1897, U.S. President William McKinley said that they needed to take Hawaii out of military necessity during the Spanish-American War. And so Queen Liliuokalani, who was the leader of the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time, instructed Hawaiians to protest peacefully to prevent more Hawaiian death. And the Ku'e petitions were signed by over 90% of Hawaiians who had just learned to write, right? So this is just a huge number of people who were opposed to this. And that was seen by the US government, but largely ignored, okay? So this image on top is actually kind of like quilts that people made at the time, and they were taught to protest using language. And so they were writing in Hawaiian songs, and they, I think at this time, a lot of people knew, I guess, that, you know, it might be the end of using Hawaiian for good, right? So they were documenting it as much as possible on not just papers, but on like these quilts. And I think, I don't know, this really touches me whenever I see these things. It's just, it's like people knew that, you know, it was so sacred to them, and it was kind of like leaving them. And this is actually when Aloha Oe was, that song that everyone knows, was written, right? It was actually kind of saying goodbye to her kingdom. So some parallels with Pidgin. So Pidgin emerged as a language kind of in the midst of bans on ōlelo Hawai'i, right? And it ultimately ended up being spoken by a majority of non-white people in Hawaii. So Kanaka Maoli, which are the indigenous people of Hawaii, as well as other plantation workers, like I said before, right? But somewhere along the line throughout history, they began to target Pidgin speakers as well, right? So there were complaints of white children being corrupted by non-white Pidgin-speaking children. There was a formal letter to the U.S. Department of Education saying, verbatim, it is unwise for the Hawaiian school system to select teachers from social groups that are the least American in blood. In 1924, the English standard school system allowed for racial segregation to become institutionalized without blatant mentions of race. So they used, right, so they're saying basically they excluded Pidgin speakers from elite schools, positioned Pidgin as inferior to English, suppressed the usage of Pidgin in formal settings, such as jobs that require higher education. And this led to lasting effects, right, on language attitudes, power structure between specifically white and non-white people. And currently, there's still no job protections. So if you speak English with a Pidgin accent, you can be fired based on the poor communication skills. And this is something that happens all the time. But it happened, and someone brought it to court, and it was denied. So, right, so that's kind of some parallels with just the same kind of struggle happening again when another language emerges, right? The British Columbia context. So I'm really going to just kind of fly through this. I feel like I'm flying through all of this history in the first place, and obviously there's a lot of context that I'm not able to kind of discuss. But yeah, if you want to keep looking, there's a lot of resources online. But I'll try my best to kind of also talk about this. So BC has the greatest diversity of indigenous cultures in Canada, actually. And there's over 200 distinct First Nations in BC, each with their own traditions and histories. and over 30 different First Nations languages and close to 60 dialects spoken in the province. The British Columbia context has a surprising amount of parallels with the Hawaiian context, right? So also, same friend in 1778, same year, Captain James Cook was the first major contact with English for First Nations people. And this, after this event came the influx of the Catholic Church and so-called explorers. Mass death due to foreign disease, mortality rates ranging based on different communities, 50% to 90% of the population. And the churches and government exerted even greater control over First Nations governments during this time, blaming traditional culture as the cause of death. And European colonizers argued that Indians were a dying race to justify control of land. The residential school system. So in 1920, so think about this, the English standard system in Hawaii was 1924, right? So 1920, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Indigenous child to attend a residential school and illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. The explicit objectives was to indoctrinate to Euro-Canadian and Christian ways of living. Specific attacks on teachers and students that were non-white, calling them ignorant, savage, and childlike in need of guidance. The system forcibly separated children from their families for extended periods of time, forbade them to speak their own languages, of course, horrendous abuse, both physical and sexual, and offered inappropriate education, often only up to lower grades, and focused mainly on prayer and manual labor in agriculture, light industry, and domestic work, right? So what are the lasting effects of these kinds of things, right? Excluding Indigenous people from elite or even normal schools in this case, right? Banning the use of language, and of course trauma associated with language and education, disparities in both physical and mental health, and ultimately placing a lot of blame on Indigenous people, right? And this magnified colonial systems of hegemony in the BC context as well, right? So why should we know about these contexts when doing linguistic work? I mean, I think it's pretty clear because in linguistic work, especially if we're working with Indigenous languages or marginalized languages as a whole, it's really important to know the context. But I kind of wanted to show you how this context specifically like really impacted just like this one thing that I worked on for a long time. So yeah. So in linguistics, I guess we don't usually do this history stuff, and so I guess that's not exactly like the main focus of my work, but of course it's really relevant, right? And so I guess this is going to be kind of an example of that. So one paper that I'm about to publish is kind of in the area of speech production, and so this is kind of like a fancy way that we say how people speak, right? And the title of this paper is Understanding Stress and Schwa and Stikwak-Makchin. So I'm going to kind of break down those points later, but I kind of just wanted to show you, I guess, how I started with this research question. So the question is, this linguist named Kuipers, he's also the guy who made the dictionary, okay, and he's the main linguist who has written all the work that people use as materials to teach children the Indigenous language, right? So even speakers of the language will use his dictionary to remind themselves of words, okay? So he's very esteemed in, I guess, in this specific way. He made a theory that all unstressed vowels in Stikwak-Makchin will reduce to schwa. And I'll talk about these terms later, but my question was, is there acoustic evidence to support his theory? The community, before I came up with this at all, I kind of asked them what would be important to kind of start with. They said, this person who made the dictionary said this thing, but we don't really know if it's true. It doesn't seem that right to us. But we've been using this dictionary, and this is the way we've been teaching. The linguist who wrote the dictionary said so, right? So it must be true, right? So I guess, yeah, I kind of wanted to test that, right? Because if the community says so, that's a really good place to start. Right, so what is Stikwak-Makchin? Stikwak-Makchin is from the northern interior branch of the Salish language family and traditionally spoken in interior BC, ranging from Kamloops to the Rockies. Right now, there's fewer than 50 native speakers of the language. Right, so what's schwa? Schwa is when this vowel that you make when your mouth is relaxed. So if you really relax your mouth and try to make a vowel sound, you'll make right? And so vowel reduction is basically this process of basically behavior that is associated with relaxed articulation, right? So when you think about it, right, unstressed vowels in some languages, it makes kind of sense to perhaps reduce in some ways, right? So if you're not stressing something, if you're not going to be placing like linguistic stress on something, then oftentimes this will be associated with more relaxation of the mouth. So it actually happens in English that unstressed vowels will often reduce to schwa. So an example of this is about, right? We'll say about because the about part is stressed, right? So about instead of about, right? Epenthetic schwa is also a type of schwa that's inserted between consonants, right? So in this word in Secwepemctsín, this word means rotten, and you can see an N and a 7, so this is like a consonant cluster. The 7 is a glottal stop, so right? And so nu'uk, but you have to put that little sound in between these two consonants, right? So this oftentimes helps with some kind of stress patterning kinds of rules, basically. So in Secwepemctsín, there's 3 different types of vowels, right? So we have the stressed vowels that are marked with this accent, and then unstressed vowels. And this man, Kuiper, said there's no difference in pronunciation between unstressed vowels and epenthetic schwa, right? So I wanted to solve this puzzle, test this hypothesis. So I located instances of stressed, unstressed, and epenthetic schwa. I recorded the words with speakers of the language. And I showed them some image. I said, can you say this for me, please? And they would say this without me showing them how it was spelled. Then I recorded the words. I measured the vowels. I measured distance and overlap. Basically to answer this question, do unstressed vowels collapse to schwa? So there's 3 different kind of hypotheses that might happen, right? Kuiper's is right. There's full reduction. Unstressed vowels are schwa. Kuiper's is kind of right, partial reduction. Unstressed vowels are not schwa, but they're closer to schwa than stressed vowels. And the last one is Kuiper's is totally wrong. There's no reduction. Unstressed vowels are the same as stressed vowels. And schwa is something else. So my methods, sorry, this part might be kind of technical, but I wanted to speak to some of the science people, okay? So, right, so how I measured vowels, right, I took formant frequencies, so these are kind of ways to measure sound acoustically. So we can see E, U, and A, and you can see the first formant is that lowest band, the dark one there, and F2 is kind of the one above it. And so F1 is the first formant frequency is inversely related to your tongue height. So if your tongue is very high, then F1 will be low. And F2 is inversely related to the backness of their tongue. So if F2 is very low, then your tongue is very forward. Does that make sense? Yeah. And this is just because your mouth is making different tubes, basically. And so when you're making sounds, right, your sound, the sound that ends up coming out will have different acoustic qualities. And this was measured in hertz. So I trained a model to identify the sound boundaries for Secwepemctsín bootstrapping with an English algorithm. And I extracted acoustic measurements using a formant tracking algorithm with my supervision. And I measured overlap using Pillai scores, math people, and closeness using Euclidean distance measures. So these are my results. I know this is kind of a lot, but I'm going to kind of point out the things that you want to take away. So if Kuiper's is right, it would look kind of like that, right? You'll have the stressed vowels on the peripheral, and then we'll have the unstressed vowels that are overlapping with schwa in the center. But we can see there's a lot of overlap all around, right? And this is actually really common in Salish languages. But we see 2 things, right? So we can see actually with the case of I and U, these are the high vowels, right? The unstressed vowels are actually more peripheral than the stressed vowels. And so that's directly a contradiction to what Kuiper said. We do see some overlap, especially with this E area. Sorry, and schwa 1 is the pink one with the upside down E. So you do see a lot of general overlap in that area, but it's not consistent with the theory that there's unstressed in there's stress in the periphery, and then it's collapsing to the schwa area in the middle, right? So it's not exactly consistent with that, although there is a lot of overlap in that area in general. But with A and O, I know it's a little hard to see from this visualization, but just with Euclidean distance measures and placing it in a linear model, you can see that the unstressed vowels are slightly closer to schwa. So this might be the case of partial reduction, but right, we do have this case where there's high vowels that are doing the opposite and low vowels that are doing maybe the same, but like partially, right? And so actually this is something that's been attested cross-linguistically in other understudied languages such as Bulgarian. So in Bulgarian, you would also see this distinction where we have high vowels raising and low and non-high vowels engaging in partial reduction. And so this articulatory theory has kind of been pushed under the rug because it's not something you see in English or major languages. But this is more consistent with jaw relaxation rather than tongue relaxation. So if your jaw is relaxing, then the high vowels that are typically made with the high tongue placement, right, are actually going to become more high. It's hard to visualize even for myself, but I think it's a really compelling theory. And so, right, was Kuiper's right? Kind of, not, mostly not, right? I kind of explained these already. One thing that was a little interesting was that you see that unstressed vowels and stressed vowels are slightly different, right? So when you're going to be engaging in just like teaching in these things, there's some ways to express the difference between stressed and unstressed vowels, and one way you can kind of one thing you might take away from this limited study is that the high vowels are actually producing the unstressed vowels with a higher kind of location, right, for those unstressed vowels. But generally, Kuiper's was mostly not right. And so some lessons with this is some issues with authority, right? So a lot of speakers were saying, well, I know that this is wrong, but this is the guy who wrote the dictionary, right? And so it's pretty, I think, common to kind of come across this, but it's also just not something that I think, there's some issues with just and it comes from this kind of history, right? Right, it's important for linguists especially to avoid using just their ears to make these categorical distinctions. And also we need to be mindful, especially I think when we're working with such contexts, to be mindful of researcher bias, right? So our auditory perception is involved with our first language oftentimes, right? So the person who wrote this dictionary was Dutch. And so this happens in Dutch, right? But it doesn't happen in this language, right? So it's really important, I think, when we come in as researchers, we have our own lens, and we kind of need to, be very critical of that when we're going into whatever work we do, especially in these kinds of contexts that are very sensitive, right? Right, and linguistics as a whole has a very strong historical Eurocentric bias, right? And so this might be affecting more work than just, what I've uncovered right here, right? And I think this is a lot more broad of a context than we might know. And there's a lot of effect that sloppy language documentation work might have, especially in language education. And there's a lot of people who work with this every day and have been working with this dictionary since the 70s, right? So it's kind of sloppy linguistic work. It has real effects, right? Right, I don't even know what I was saying here, but right, I think in general when we're working with languages that have been historically excluded from academic spaces, it's just really important for us to really be sensitive to the relationship that people have with their languages and these contexts in academic spaces as a whole. And I think also just reframing the idea of authority is something that's hard to it's hard to disentangle sometimes, right? Especially when you have a history of trauma with it, right? Present realities, right? And what I've discussed today is not just with Indigenous languages or marginalized languages, but stigmatized varieties of English, right? And other major languages. So languages actually, language varieties might index marginalized classes, race, sexual orientations, gender, right? So you might talk differently if you are of this, one of these, or you will talk differently based on a lot of social factors, right? And oftentimes minoritized groups will also have minoritized language patterns, right? Language varieties. And so language stigma is really a present reality wherever you are in whatever community, whatever language you speak, right? There's this concept of language properness, but really that's nothing more than speaking with like the people who have power, right? Colonial attitudes on language really persist in the present, right? And these hegemonies that have been institutionalized in the past are very much present, right? And also these constructs on what is useful or valuable or even correct, right, are guided by these hegemonies and these histories, right? And we just need to remember these things. I just kind of wanted to say that this is not just negative. I know that sometimes we talk about these intense things and it's just this sad story. But Indigenous and stigmatized languages are a source of pride for many people, and a lot of people are taking it back. Taking back our language as well as our methodologies and our authority, right? And there's something called covert prestige, right? So I talked about overt prestige as this kind of powerful language, right? But covert prestige is kind of this in-groupness, right? And so if you're speaking a marginalized language, sometimes it's a language that you can kind of align yourself with groups that were also marginalized, or and you're speaking languages against those who carried out exploitation. So sometimes this speaking of a language that's stigmatized is kind of this act of rebellion in the first place, right? So this is something that's pretty fun about language work and just, speaking languages that are stigmatized, right? So I really want to hear, if there's time, I really hope I didn't talk too much. Oh man. Okay, I guess that's not too bad. I just want to know other people's stories with language and diglossia and stigmatization and how your home countries or communities have been affected. I just put up kind of like some of the ones that we're talking about with negatives, but there's also positives, right? And I just want to kind of open up the discussion to hear, because I really am curious to hear how this affects other communities. So thanks for listening to me talk.
I've now been tasked with the arduous task of moderating the Q&A. When you have a topic of this sort, it's often incredibly difficult to delineate the scholarly presentation, which is often tied with personal traumas, communal experiences, concepts of power, hegemonistic and altruistic or ulterior motives. So as you pose your question, I would encourage you to be mindful that Mitchi is a third-year PhD student in the linguistics department and not political science.
Yes.
Thank you. But with that, please be sensitive and mindful of how your question can sort of encourage and fuel the discussion forward. So please raise your hands. State your name when you pose your question, where you come from, and very briefly your question. Pedro?
Oh man, I knew this was coming with the math people and the physics people. Okay, yeah, what was your question?
It's just, so what you've done is you talk to different people, and then you know them.
Yeah.
I guess it will like kind of the frequency.
Yeah.
What is F1 and F2?
Oh yeah, so these are so you know how so yeah, I'm speaking to a physicist, so correct me if I'm wrong, but so I know, so what I think what we're taught is that, so each sound will have many frequencies, right, in sound, right? And so the most amplified sounds are going to be F1 and F2. and when talking about vowels especially, but like I think they're also characteristic when you're making a very unconstricted sound with your mouth, right? So if you have a very constricted sound, then these formants will not be amplified. So it's like amplification of like certain formants in the sound.
So we see, like, for example, when you say a vowel, like two dominant frequencies, F1 and F2?
Yeah, so these are the most amplified, well, somewhat, right? So actually you can see that there's more amplification if you see in this chart. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see that there's more amplification kind of extending upwards, right? So that would be F3, F4, yeah, these formant frequencies, F1 and F2 are really, are used a lot in linguistics because they have this relationship with where the tongue is when you're producing them. So it really helps you, I guess, measure where the vowel is in your mouth.
So,
yeah.
One last thing. When you say that you do the Pidgin distance, what I'm guessing is that you are like measuring the distance between these two frequencies.
Yeah.
Do you measure the distance between F1 and F2 and then you construct a chart?
Yeah, you know, do you know what PLI scores like entail? Like, so it's like, so PLI score, I use PLI scores to do this, and it's like a multivariate. Right. But because it has like the ability to have two variables that are placed in the model, then I put F1 and F2 there in the model to compare the two. So based on, so overlap based on those variables, essentially. And then the same variables were placed when I was finding the Euclidean distance. So it's kind of like these vowels and the clusters of the vowels, right, in this kind of space. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Keeping me honest with my methods. Thanks. Oh no, it's another math person. Okay, hi. What is a what? A cosine of linguistics?
I have one question and one personal story which is not too crazy, but more regarding accent.
Oh, that's relevant.
But the question is, why did Kripos or Wipers
Yeah.
why did he write about the Hawaiian languages and not someone from Hawaii?
Oh, so he wrote on Secwepemctsín, which is the BC language. But he was Dutch, right? So he is not from that community. But it's often, I think, especially in the past, and also very much in the present, a lot of linguists are coming from outside and are doing language work on communities that they are not a part of. And so he was just a famous linguist that was traveling to different communities. So he's done this with other language contexts as well. He happened to find it interesting. Yeah.
But how come that he's accepted?
Because he wrote a dictionary. He is, he's very much accepted because he's the first person to write a dictionary. I think before he wrote this dictionary, it was also an oral language, right? So a lot of times when you have the linguist coming in and kind of giving an orthography system, he's the one who wrote the orthography system. So this is how people know how to, this is a reference point in reading and writing in the first place, right? So of course he's someone who a lot of people will listen to. And I think that's, when you have authority placed with even the writing system of the language, then sometimes you also have to look at who's the one who wrote it. And in these cases, it's extra, it has a lot more weight because it's really just one linguist who's worked on this for a lot, like since the 70s, right? And maybe other people who are from within the community have worked with their own language, but there's a lot of authority that comes from people who are educated in these, fancy titles and these things, right? So that's perhaps why.
I think any linguistic also writing for a person who's not inside the same linguistic should not be accepted in the sense of this works on the linguistic.
Most languages are written by linguists that are not from the community. The Hawaiian language as well was people make jokes that Hawaiian is a very small, has a very small consonant inventory, but actually it was because it was collapsed by linguists who didn't have, I guess, a special ear and were relating it to English. So there's a lot of context like this, and it's hard because it's been the authority for so long, right? People really have a lot of, right, like I think like reading and writing, if it's not a traditional in your language, like learning how to do that is like great because it's like, wow, we could write down all of our stories and these things, and it's something that people use, but there's a lot of authority that comes with, oh, well, this person knows how to do this. This is a linguist who's an expert, and he, you know, knows how to write alphabets and dictionaries for our community. And yeah, it's just, it's hard. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Then a personal story.
Mm.
So my parents, coming from the German Democratic Republic, which was also Soviets were there, they kept the people down, and this was pretty much dictatorship.
Mhm.
And now, since the wall is down, also the accents from that place
Mhm.
become kind of inferior accents,
Mhm.
or accents which are kind of more people don't, they're not so intellectual, or so they don't know much, maybe so kind of more primitive people or also Japanese. And I think this was not, but I could read about this before the German Democratic Republic. I think this is an artifact from the GDR.
Mhm.
But it is pretty much still the case, and also I had to learn proper
Mhm.
German,
Mhm.
which is fine to an extent, but not to the extent of that people are looking weird to you, especially in smaller villages like in
Mhm.
Western German countries, for example.
Mhm.
And yeah, my mom had really cared about me, about picking up the
That's, yeah, no, I mean, that's, yeah, again, like this is something that you see all over the world, and it's quite, I think it's kind of sad, right, that people have to kind of teach their kids a different way of speaking with the intention of, well, I know that if they speak like me, or, you know, like, then they'll face the same discrimination that I faced, and that's a really, I think that's a sad thing. Yeah, but thanks for sharing. Yes, language people. It might be a harder question, actually.
Thank you so much, Mitchi, for sharing your research and also talking about some very personal topics. Again, I understand perspective here. So my question is perhaps related to the things that you highlighted yourself about Eurocentric standards and linguistics and let's say very much colonial ways of knowing and methodologies that you criticize.
Right.
And my question to you is, so since this researcher documented the language almost 50 years ago, as old as our parents, I guess, our parents, right? So the question is basically how are the methodologies different now? Like how exactly are you guys using the colonial or decolonizing methodologies in documenting these languages, and also how did this person document the language? Did he consider specific things? And again, as Marilyn earlier said, how exactly is this word questioned now, or is it even questioned in the community itself, right? And what kind of I don't know, activities are there in your department, for example, that are working towards let's say methodologies from
Yeah.
linguistics, right? So that's my question.
Mhm.
If you have any story to share,
Yeah.
if you think that it's not being done enough, what kind of let's say ways forward do you see for your department or for your field?
Okay. There's I think multiple questions, right? So one question is if people still really look up to this person. Yes, very much, very, very much so. Even to get this, I had to kind of really say they did. So this was kind of in a very academic article that was very, very long. So this wasn't attached to the dictionary. So I asked them, hey, you know, if I pronounce this, is it going to be different than this? Is it going to sound like this sound? And they're like, no. But then I said, oh, you know, the guy who wrote the dictionary said that. And they're like, oh, we've been teaching that it's kind of more like that. But actually, now that you say it, like, it was just kind of one of these things where they didn't, like, they couldn't even think that this person could be wrong. And even when I was doing this exercise of like recording these words, they would be like, oh, let me check the dictionary. I'm like, no, like, because this is not what you want to do, because then you'll consult kind of just back to the same person who wrote the orthography, right? When it comes to methodologies, I think sorry, and before then you were also saying, how did Kuipers do this? Yeah, so he didn't have these fancy tools and models and algorithms, right? So he just kind of heard, like, and a lot of linguists did this. They're like, this sounds like in my language, you know, like, this is how I'm going to write it. And I guess they, you know, I'm making fun of it, but like, I mean, I guess that's actually how people did it in the past. But like, I mean, I think a lot of people of the community are like, well, he like made it so we could write, you know. So I mean, there's like, it's just a complex story, right? And I think with current methodologies, we talk about this. There's a lot, I think, that are still very much is still very much appealing to authority, right? So like, why do I need to do this in order to say that they're right? You know, like, and this kind of thing is really hard to confront. I think that there is some appealing to authority that I need to do to make my study even seem like, okay, that now people believe me, right? And I think a lot of that is difficult, right? Because there's a lot of other ways that we could approach these kinds of questions. And, you know, if people are saying that it doesn't, you know, sound right to them, then, you know, that should be the ultimate authority. I am trying my best to also incorporate different experts, or like, and try to shift the expertise to the speaker, regardless of if they say, and this happens all the time. I work with really esteemed members of the community, and they're saying, oh, but your professor said something else, but my professor kind of speaks the language. And he has a PhD, and he thinks that he's authority, I guess. And so our consultants really like, oh, did you ask your professor how to spell it? Like, oh, did your classmate knows how to spell this language really well? Oh, you know, like, let me check Kuipers. This happens every time even if I said, oh, just, you know, this is a guy who, he didn't know anything, you know. Of course you can't say that, because this is a lot of the people I work with are language teachers, and this is the work that they, you know, that they've been using for like longer than I've been alive, you know. So it's really complex, and I think that we can try our best, but yeah, it's hard for me to confront every day. Like, I really think about this all the time. Like, am I doing a disservice? You know, like, so I'm trying my best.
Yeah. Just last one.
Yeah.
I think that I can see how much you're trying personally as well, and also there is a very thin line between like being complicit in like using the same like old methods and like trying to like disrupt these ideologies and also like kind of use some more critical approaches. Right? I just hope that like when documenting languages like this, we consider that languages are not static and they change over time, and of course, the language that he documented 50 years ago is going to be different.
Oh, yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah.
Because language doesn't stay in the same place; it's dynamic, right?
Right.
It's dependent on the environment.
Right, and it's you're really right.
That like whatever we say in our papers doesn't end up being very descriptive.
Right.
Then
right. Exactly. That's really important.
that's the only right way.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's really contextualized. Like, you know, this is, in my writing, whatever, it's like, oh, I did it this way, but these are the problems with that. You know, this is like a really specific formal setting too, right? Which will activate certain ways of speech, for example, that are, yeah. Hi. Oh. Balkanize these.
Okay, so I just want to ask this because, has there ever been been like, is there a case of the Creole languages in what is colonial referred to as BC or even colonial?
Yes, this is an interesting question. I know there are contact languages, but a lot of people are hesitant to call them Creoles. I guess because sometimes certain communities really don't like this idea of mixture, and they exist. Like a lot of these contact languages exist, but I think that I think it takes certain ingredients sometimes to like really have it become this like first language, and so that's kind of what you need for it to become a Creole. And so sometimes you have mixed languages and like contact languages that are kind of like something that people use every day and like mixture that happens. But yeah, Creole, like sometimes Creole has like these specific ingredients, but also there's this other element of people hesitating to bring legitimacy to a language that's kind of mixed with a indigenous language and a colonial language, right? So there's a lot of like hesitancy sometimes. I don't think that there is a Creole in BC that, a language that calls itself a Creole in BC that I'm aware of. There might be. I know that there's some with even this Secwepemctsín language. There's some mixed languages, but I don't think that they're calling it a Creole. And I think linguistically it might not be a Creole. But there are in, so like the Cree community has a mixture of Cree and French, and so that's like Métis, yeah. And so that's a Creole in Canada, yeah. Oh, yeah. So that's one that I was also, so the fact that they called it jargon, I was like really unsure if it was a Creole or a Pidgin or a mixed language, and there's just not been much work on it. But yeah, that is a BC language as well, that I think might be in that area of Creole. Yeah. When I asked my consultants about this, they were like, I don't think that's the language that anyone speaks as a first language, but I don't know. It's very much possible. Thanks. Did you have another question? Oh.
Well, I was going to ask you a question more about people learning language generally.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, with the school as well. I was trying to get into some good universities, and they just kind of said you won't get into what you want to do. And I said, you've got to have them teaching lessons. Mm-hmm. So I did these things, they were like, say your teeth. So say your name, like Scott, and like Scott. And I didn't really work. I always felt like I was doing like a really bad impression of someone else. Mm-hmm. I was wondering whether it was actually possible to do that and to absolutely change the way you speak.
I think yeah. Is it possible to change the way you speak?
It does, if you're learning a language, you already know, relearning the language.
Yeah. So I think, this sounds like something that's called bidialectalism. So you can learn a different dialect of the language that you speak, and sometimes this happens where, maybe it might be the same context where you're going to speak fancy in one place, and you're going to speak like yourself in another place, and that is also kind of a type of this stigmatization, diglossia situation that I was talking about, but it's maybe less of, maybe more something like bidialectalism, and so. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you forget the language that, you're most comfortable with because you're always in these places where I have to talk smart all the time, right? But sometimes you're bidialectal and you speak both languages, right? And I think a lot of people, all of us, we're all here in grad school. We all have our smart voice and our friend's voice and these things, right? So we're all bidialectal at very least, right? And I think that it's all kind of, the same theme of things, right? Stigmatization, this is a wrong way of speaking, this is not proper, right? Like, that's all the same stuff at the end of the day. Thanks for your question. This is a joke that Merlin made at dinner once, and I don't... You don't have to be fast. You can be.
I am Cameroonian, and Cameroon was colonized by the French and the English, and thus the systems of the language system that there are hundreds of languages in Cameroon before that, but and then there's this colonial order means that you're kind of thrown into these two systems, language systems and the architecture of like governance surrounding it. And not to get into the problems that has caused for the country to this point, but then I also like moved to Canada, which is also bilingual French and English. And it's just really interesting because my mom like grew up. My mom is from the French-speaking part. My dad's from English. My mom learned French learned English fluently after I was born. And so for those reasons, kind of similar to what was said about how, and we were in the English-speaking parts of the world, which was that I never really learned French at home. I want to say formally, but it would be like I didn't learn it through like my mom speaking it to me. I could understand it really well, but it was really only when I came to Canada, and then because of the formal education system here and how it works, that you learn it that way, and then you're just told that you speak. Well, I was told that my French, other Creole, etc. So then, cut to now, and I'm just kind of a lot more interested in learning more about like my own culture, and less so in learning French, however anyone speaks it. And what kind of resonated to me with your experience in engaging with the community for this paper was that this reliance and the reliance on orthography and how important that is to being able to kind of to create an archive or index of the language and then teach it again.
Right.
And I guess and I am thinking about what the even though language does change, the implications then of a language being like a little Hawai'i being collapsed down to so many consonants and so on and so on. What does that mean then? What else am I trying to say? And even just in the fact that the creating of the written versions of this language, or the collating of it in relation to a colonial language, so how to say things from that language to English or to French or etc. I guess kind of maybe this is extension in some respect of what Sarah Wilson was asking around methodology, but also maybe more broadly, how did you kind of you kind of talked about it a bit more, but how do you kind of engage with the fact that now, considering the colonial context that these languages are kind of existing in, there is all of this work done to try and preserve languages and everything else, but then the methods of doing so and the means of doing so are so marked by this colonial interference.
Right.
How does that impact that work being done in order to retain this important aspect of culture?
Yeah. It's a really good question. Okay, sorry, I was scared that you were tell me it's done, and I'm like, no, this is a good question. There's a lot I can say. Okay, so first of all, the context that I'm working with, these speakers are, this speaker in particular that I work with the most, her mother was the last monolingual speaker of the language. And she did not know how to write or read, and so none of it had to do with Kuipers. So when I try to do these methods, I'm saying, I say to her, okay, try not to even think about how to spell it, right? And just think about how your mom would say it. And she gives that all the time. She's like, my mom says it like this, and it's the best. And this is kind of my hope is to try to tap into that as much as possible. When working with her, and she kind of gives that up. She loves to talk about, I think, her mother, and I think that kind of this approach is staying away from the spelling and these things. The spelling in English is really weird too, right? And so I think that explaining it that way helps it feel less alien, and it kind of helps, I guess, stay away from that. You're talking about borrow words with English and French as well, right? Or sort of, right? How you have to kind of use a language, another word, and
sort of. So my experience as well in both the language that my mom speaks, is that all of the documentation and I guess the orthography of it is written in relation to French.
Right.
So I still do actually have to learn French
in
order to engage with it. But even that, with respect to it doesn't necessarily it almost is in this whatever it doesn't stand.
Yeah. It's really hard. Like I think that there's some contexts where really the main source of your knowledge is based on these orthographies, and I think usually the answer is to try to move away from orthography as much as possible and like ask an oral source. But I don't know if that's always possible. If it's not possible, I think that there's a lot of like work done in certain contexts to kind of reverse these things. So in the Hawaiian example, they are kind of looking at, okay, well, this person who had an English ear wrote it this way, but Samoan and Maori, that's really related languages, do this, and kind of like reversing that and saying, oh, well, this actually sounds more like this sound. And they actually did that with Hawaiian, where they realized that like a more, like I guess, a genetically related language had like this one sound, and they realized that actually that was the most authentic way to say it. So there's some work that's been done on looking at related languages, and trying to get to the oral source as much as possible. Thanks. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah. Thank you so much for your question.
I've just been mindful of the time. We're 9:05. I've got 2 hands up, so if everyone's okay with that,
I'm fine. I love it.
If not, you can come and ask Mitchi later. How is everyone feeling? We're happy with 2 more questions? Yeah? Does you want to go?
Yeah. Muslim, I'm originally from Nepal, so for those of you who don't know, Nepal is like 6 times smaller than BC in terms of area, but we have over 120 actively spoken languages.
Wow.
And I think we're able to save those languages because we're one of the 2 countries in the whole world that was never colonized.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But my question is more in terms of the future. So as a linguistic, following linguistics, right? Because there is now this increasing, I think, work towards using artificial intelligence where people will be able to communicate with each other without actually speaking the same language. So do you think that kind of technology would help in, kind of art the process of one language dominating the other?
Yeah. Okay, so I think, yeah. So there is this concept of a lot of work that is done with AI is very biased, right? It's not just biased in one language, but it's like biased in like the way that the variety of that language, right? So like even if it's going to, so oftentimes it'll be English, and oftentimes it's a special type of English. We actually saw, I saw this really great talk recently where this person was showing how AI could be racialized and how people could, people would not understand it anymore, and these things. And actually, there's like Amazon is making this new thing where it can tell you what your emotions are based on if you sound pleasant or not, and it was completely racialized. Like it was completely saying that people who were not white were speaking wrong or speaking like in a bad tone or these things. So she kind of did this study. But I guess I don't think that it means that, or necessarily, I guess it depends on a political kind of context of like what people do with it. But I think the main thing that we need to remember is that like multilingualism is like very much a thing, and like it's very much possible. And I think a lot of people think, well, I need to speak English to deal with my PhD. I need to speak English to kind of deal with the outside world and use this technology and these things. But I think that one, there's a push to use multilingual technologies, and I think people are actively doing these things. But two, I think that speaking another language doesn't always mean collapsing the other one. And I think it just needs to be clear that this one language is not better than the other, right? And I think that those value systems is kind of what ends up collapsing languages, because you'll get the things like Merlin said, you're not teaching your kids the language anymore. I think that's kind of what happens with like languages kind of falling away. Yeah. But thanks for your question. You're my Hawai'i.
Thanks, Mitchi. Super interesting. I have a kind of easy, quick question. I was just curious. I was thinking about Pidgin again and Hawaii, and we talked about this before, but like I never really thought about it until you talked about dialects of other languages and BC and stuff like that. But I was just curious. I mean, are there dialects of Pidgin?
This is such a great question. I'm really happy that someone from, I was going to trip. Someone from Hawaii is in here because, yeah, that's a really excellent question. Linguists don't know this. I've asked this question before, and I'm trying to do this actually. So there's 8 islands, right? 8 main islands, and Pidgin, I think, has a lot of differences. Your Pidgin so you're from the same place my mom is, and I think there's differences in generation as well as, like location. But I think the current stance is, so one person did like a huge study where it was kind of like across islands and across like in town and outside of town, right? Town being Honolulu and outside. And so I think the common consensus from that study, and it wasn't his focus, but one thing that he kind of recognized was that there's Honolulu Pidgin, which is kind of like not really like really traditional, I guess. And then there's kind of like more consistency when you get outside of Honolulu. But Kauai is like mean, like it's like crazy, like out of this world, like really different Pidgin than like Kauai. Yeah. So like instead of saying when for the past, they'll say had. I had jump. I had eat. Yeah, so there's like a lot of weird, there is a lot of, I think, diversity in how Pidgin is spoken across the islands. Yeah, there is, the hardest thing though, I think, is that even within Pidgin spaces and academic spaces and how that intersects, like people have a lot of opinions on what is correct Pidgin, which is like really awkward and like, so there's one person who teaches at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he's like from Kauai, and he's like in a certain age range, and he's like, this new stuff is not Pidgin. Like Honolulu Pidgin is not Pidgin. And so he teaches a class and he teaches them Pidgin, but he'll like be prescriptive in like his in what he accepts as like grammatical Pidgin, which I think is like really difficult because there's a lot of like even that kind of bias from within the community, right? So there's a lot of appeals to like who's the authority in these things. But yeah, thanks so much for your question. What do people think about Big Island? So my mom is from Big Island. He's from Big Island. I don't know. That's like the main source of my Pidgin. So my Pidgin is from my mother, and my mother's from Big Island. Steve's from Big Island. I don't know what other people think about our Pidgin, but I think like comparing it to like my high school, like it does sound different. Like my mother would never say chihu, you know? Like, yeah.
I guess people say chihu.
But I think my mom is like also from a different generation. Will you hear an old guy say chihu? Sorry, we're like having but I love the question a lot. There's varieties in terms of age and island. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot, everyone, for turning up. If you do have any questions, I'm pretty sure Mitchi would be happy to stay around for just a couple of minutes, not too long. And so feel free to grab her after the presentation.
I love it.
I'd also like to remind you guys before you leave that filmmaker and psychologist Yan would be presenting her research methods on climate change and climate resistance tomorrow here at the Coach House from 5 to 6:30, and there's tea from 4:30 in that room. So please make sure you turn up. Drinks too? Flashy. Yeah, so tea and drinks.
Wow.
Tomorrow. So please make sure you turn
Is tea not a drink? That's a semantic question.
It is.
Even if you don't make it to the talk, you might come and just have a drink with her afterwards. That would be fine. She and Tom will be hanging out this week, so if you see them around, you still enjoy that. Come back tomorrow.
Oh, more than the time.